Hello, everyone. We'll start in about 2 to 3 minutes for Tom Lynn. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with author Tom Lynn. My name is Michael Takeuchi, and I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Books, a 47-year-old independent bookstore located in Santa Barbara, California. To purchase tonight's book, browse other books, or to check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. We will be taking a 2-week hiatus after tonight's event from all virtual events. We hope to come back with some live events, but we do have one virtual event on July 15th planned, where we'll bring out fellow debut novelist TJ Newman. She's making her debut with her July 6th release thriller, Falling a Novel, a book that will be adapted by Universal Pictures. While our guests and myself are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, there's a Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to utilize that, and we will get to your questions as we go along. Tonight's event is being simulcasted on YouTube and as well as being recorded as well. So it will be available for view after program's completion. If you have any questions, please use the chat function or email me directly at events@chaucersbooks.com. All right, so I'm gonna turn on the recorder here. So here we go. Tonight, Chaucer's Books welcome Tom Lynn, the author of his debut novel, The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, a Little Brown and Company book that is garnering much deserved critical praise from national publications like the New York Times Book Review and NPR, among others. Hello, Tom.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure that you're joining us. Thank you. You know, I have to say that with its superb storytelling, this is a book I enjoyed thoroughly in its entirety. It conjured up vivid images through your superior storytelling, through your dream sequences, and through your prose. And it called to mind watching movies like classic movies like The Outlaw Josie Wales or Once Upon a Time in the West. And it felt like I was watching it in the now unfortunately closed Hollywood Cinerama Dome, because it was so wide scoped and beautiful that it's just an amazing book. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been blown away by all the kind words from all those places, and it's it's just amazing to hear that people are out there enjoying it.
So how is that? I mean, you're a first-time novelist. How is that to take? I mean, you're plugging away for a few years on this. You're writing a novel. You're not sure anybody wants to read it, and then boom, it's out, and everybody loves it. People are talking about it. You know, how are you reacting to all this?
It's definitely pretty surreal, and I think the predominant emotion is one of kind of unending gratitude. And I think the other funny thing is, like, writing a book and then publishing it is in a way, a kind of roundabout way, assigning all of your friends like reading homework. That like all of a sudden, not only do they have to go and pick up a book, they have to like read it and have something nice to say to you about it as well. And so I just am so grateful to all those people.
Yeah.
But it's exactly as you say, because you plug away at this for so long, and writing for me is so fraught with terror, and
Mm.
it's such a kind of grueling process for me. And what I would do is I would kind of finish a chapter and immediately make my girlfriend read it, Elizabeth P.S. Rosari, who's in this meeting actually, and she would have to tell me that it was good. Kind of regardless of whether or not it was good. And so for a long time, it was just kind of me producing these chapters one at a time and kind of forcing them upon this person. And then ultimately for it to become a book and to have other people be reading it, it it feels like letting people into your home, and then they only have
Mm.
nice things to say about all of your furnishings. It's a very weird experience, and I
Mm.
hope I never get used to it.
Well, speaking of into your home, your family came over from Beijing via Australia when you were about 4, was it? And
Yes,
you
yeah.
ended up in Flushing Meadows in New York. How'd you guys end up there?
We actually, it was, I think we had a church friend in Australia who knew another church friend in Flushing. Like this kind of like
Mhm.
long
Mhm.
chain of friends that we rode all the way to our home in New York. And
Mhm.
when we first got to America, we didn't have an apartment or anything, and we actually crashed with a church friend. I don't know if it was the same one. We crashed with a church friend in their basement for quite a long time, a couple months, until we
Mhm.
finally got an apartment for ourselves. Um, I and I think that is a path that a lot of these new wave Chinese immigrants, since 1960 have been taking. I think Flushing
Mhm.
is. I know Queens is the most linguistically diverse place on the planet. Period.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the Flushing Chinatown is one of the fastest growing concentrations of Chinese, ethnic Chinese, anywhere outside of China. But don't quote me on that because I don't know about the
Okay.
newest census.
So when you were a child, what piqued your imagination? Was it movies, books, graphic novels?
I read a huge amount. We had a TV. We didn't have cable. So I also watched a lot of PBS. But it was mostly afternoon spent at the library reading everything that I could get my hands on, often out of order. So I think I have a lot of memories of these kinds of like cultural touchstones, like Animorphs or something, but I have no idea what the
Mhm.
story is because they were never all in one place at the library, and I was just picking them off
Mhm.
whenever I could get one. And so I read a huge amount as a kid, and then once the internet kind of became a thing, I watched a lot of movies, and I think those are the two things that really drew me as a kid. But I loved to talk. I was a very annoying kid, I think, because I would whenever it seemed that anyone in the house had a free moment, I would pin them down and I would give them a lecture, um, just based on something that I like had heard about. And they were very patient and kind with me, and they suffered through those lectures. But I was always talking. I was always reading and talking, and I think my parents were grateful for when I was asleep.
But this talking, did it translate into writing when you were younger? Did you gain an
Yeah,
interest?
yeah. I tried writing a bunch of times, and I remember in elementary school we got those kind of pre bound blank hardcover books that are so you can write in them. And I remember thinking, this is gonna be my book. And it was an abortive attempt. I didn't get, I think, more than a third of the way through. And I think it was titled Cinder Ashley, and it was incoherent. And so, but I always liked writing, and I would always do it on the side, but kind of in an apprehensive, kind of secretive way, because
Mhm.
I knew even as a kid, and then certainly as I grew older, I knew that it was not a promising career trajectory, and certainly not a career that my parents wanted to see me on, um,
Mhm.
in this new
Yeah.
country. But I ended up studying English in college, and then I went
Mhm.
to grad school, and still am doing that for English as well. So I think I ended up being close to literature despite everything, which I think is wonderful.
Yes, which is it's incredible because your father's a physician and your mother's in the medical field. So you would figure with the Asian traditions, they would say, hey, you need to be a doctor. You need to go to Harvard or Stanford, otherwise you're a failure. Or if you're a C student, you go to Berkeley or UCLA or something. So how were they convinced that you weren't throwing your life away by becoming a writer?
And they certainly wanted me to become a doctor. And I think up until even a couple of years ago, we kind of, as a family, all agreed to kind of participate in the collective delusion that at some point I was going to do night school for pre-med or something like that. That I would have like a Saul to Paul moment and see the light and become a doctor.
Okay.
But I think I was just very stubborn. And one thing, and I said this earlier in an interview, and I kind of mangled it, and I got a call from my mom later asking me to clarify it and like do a correction. So what I had said was that my parents work hard so that I don't have to work hard, for which I got a call admonishing me. God forbid anyone believed that my parents didn't raise me to work hard. So it was clarified to me. My parents work hard doing something they dislike so that I could do something I like and work hard at that. Certainly, as much, if not harder than they did. And so that was kind of the understanding that I was grateful for all they had done to kind of build a life here, and that I was going to use that opportunity to pursue something that I really liked. And I think they were very understanding. Although they did make me do an internship at a hospital in high school just to see if I maybe I would fall in love with it. And I remember in the operating room, everything above the waist is considered sterile. Everything below the waist is considered not sterile. So after you scrub in, your hands are sterile. They have to remain above your waist. And you can't cross your hands because your gown is not sterile. And you can't drop your hands below your waist either. So you're in there, and I'm what, like 17, and I'm holding my hands up here in this position for, like 4 to 5 hours observing. And I remember, it was cool the first time, and then I came back the second day, and I was like, I think I want to do English.
So they were okay with you transitioning that to that?
Yeah, okay is generous.
Okay.
They signed off on it, yeah.
But, I think I read somewhere that you had mentioned that your parents accepted it because they did something they didn't want to do to support you, to make you to be successful, but you're able to do something that you want to do to be successful. And I think that's what generationally Asian American families do, is they pass that on.
Yeah, and I think also what normally kind of gets attached to that, either intentionally or unintentionally, is like some measure of guilt. And when I pointed this out to my mother, she was like, "No guilt, no guilt. What? No guilt." So
okay.
There's that spoken for.
Okay, before we talk about the book, what do they think of the book?
My mother read it with a dictionary beside, and she said it was full of vocab words, but she could tell that it was very nice.
That's great.
And I believe, there's a copy that's headed for my dad in China, but I foolishly didn't get a tracking number because I thought that was too expensive. And so we have no idea where it is. I may have to end up sending him a second copy.
Okay. Well, very nice is a huge compliment. I mean, in our culture, I think.
Absolutely.
I think that's like Pulitzer Prize, right?
It's glowing.
Yeah. So, a Western. I mean, there are a few other younger, Chinese American writers. C. Pam Zhang, How Much of These Hills is Gold. Jenny Zhang is coming out with Four Treasures of the Sky next year. Why a Western?
I think we all. I bet we all have different motivations for approaching it because the things that we've produced are so different. But I think for me at least, it was that the Western is it's just cool. It's so cool and it's so classic, and it figures in part of this larger narrative for Americans up until recently white Americans, for how the West was won, how this country found its roots, and this kind of, it became a creation narrative for Americans. And the funny thing is, the first Western, so Westerns, historically are usually set around 1860 or so. And the first Western started coming out in early 1900s, like 1902 or so. And at which point they're talking about something that happened 40 years ago. So it'd be like if we wrote a book about the 80s. And the fact that now, 125, 150 years later, we're still talking about that era. It's like if we were into the 80s for the next 100 years. It's unbelievable. And so the Western I think, has become central in this kind of American mythic of how we came to occupy this land and why it was deservedly so. Why it ought to have been such. And it simply by taking that kind of archetypal Western and substituting the protagonist for Chinese American, and watching how that change propagates through the story and what it modifies, I think was really fascinating for me. And also, I just wanted to write a story with a Chinese American hero that was just cool, just did a lot of action, and didn't play second fiddle to some other more central white protagonist. It's just his story, and he's got an action-packed thing to do, and that's it, and it's fun, and we love it, and that's it. I think that's something that you don't really get to see a lot of. You don't get to see a lot of Chinese Americans centrally just doing their own thing and being cool.
He was definitely no Cato, and which is he was his own man. We'll talk about him in a minute. But the Chinese American experience coming over in the 1800s, they're essentially invisible to history. And let's see, let me grab this photo here. Which is opposite of what your story is. And I find it really interesting because people would say that, Chinese Americans were a big part of America. And Erica Lee wrote in The Making of Asian America, her book, that Leland Stanford said that Chinese were quiet, peaceful, industrious, and economical. And without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national highway, meaning the railroad. Yet when you show them the iconic photo of Promontory Point, you see nary a Chinese face amongst them. They're essentially invisible. And I think your character, Ming Su, is invisible, and I think he uses that to his advantage. And if you could talk a little bit about who Ming Su is.
Yeah. So Ming Su is he's an assassin. He was born in America and then orphaned when his parents were killed, and he was adopted by Silas Root, who is the leader of this crime syndicate based out of Sacramento. And Silas raises Ming to be kind of his own child almost. But he also raises him to kill, to be a hitman, and to kind of turn that invisibility to his advantage, to kill and kind of be, subsumed into the faceless masses of these Chinese immigrants who are never really seen or remembered. And when he falls in love with Ada, who is white, he asks Silas to leave the syndicate, and Silas grants him that. And Ada's father has him actually tried for miscegenation or interracial marriage, and has him sent away to a labor camp, and he abducts Ada as well. And that is, that's why we meet Ming in Utah as he's kind of on a warpath headed back to California, and he's going to use all these skills that were kind of implanted into him to turn him into a tool. He's going to use those to his own advantage, to kind of operate in this Western context and take revenge.
Interesting, but it's not just Ming Su. I mean, Ming Su is a very, I would say, enigmatic character because, he reminds me of Omar from The Wire. He has a code, and he lives by that code. Omar lived by the shotgun. Ming Su lived by the rail spike, which I think is the coolest weapon to use since Javier Bardem used in No Country for Old Men with the little cattle gun. but he's just a really interesting character. But he's not the only one that's interesting. You have the prophet, this blind man. If you could talk a little about who the prophet is.
Yeah, the prophet is he is ancient. No one really knows how old he is, and he's blind, but he seems to be able to see things or to know things. And the thing about the prophet is that he can't remember anything about his past. He has no way of forming memories, but he can see the future. He knows the date of every single person's death, except for Ming Su,
Wow.
and that's why he calls Ming the man out of bounds, because he doesn't know when Ming will die. And in addition to knowing these kinds of death dates, he also has strange knowledge of kind of deep time, geological time. He seems to know about events that happened millions of years ago that shaped this land, and he tells the party this as they're traveling.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And he has some unique, I would say, superpowers in the sense he's not a man of action, but it called to mind Zatoichi, the blind samurai, who could react certain ways, but he does it through his voice. And I just find that really interesting. But as I said before, he's not the only one that's really interesting. I mean, you have a group of traveling show performers that Ming Su and the Prophet meet up with and spend some time with. If you can talk a little bit about that, and I think you have some reading surrounding
that actually goes straight into the reading. So Ming would love to travel alone. He's not really a company kind of guy, but he is on his way to Sacramento when he meets this traveling magic show full of strange and supernatural people that end up becoming his friends. And that actually is the chapter that I'm going to read for you guys today. So this is chapter 11 out of the book, 1,000 Crimes of Ming Su. And go ahead. Chapter 11. In the gambling tent, he played craps and robbed his table blind. He downed tumblers of whiskey and vodka and played faro, winning fistfuls of coins and bills that he stuffed down into his pockets. The world rocked uneasily on a subtle axis, and he stumbled out into the cold, clean night. He went trawling drunk through the deserted streets in search of a fight, but found none. He had lost his way. The woman came so silently and easily out of the night that when she first whispered into his ear, he did not startle, but only looked at her when face a moment. It was as though she had always already been by his side, the heat of her breath forever on his cheek. Care to see some miracles? She asked. They were stopped in the dirt road, and in the darkness she took his hands in hers and led him a short ways from the barren road into a tent shining with lamplight. A magic show, she said. Miracles to see and admire. The real thing. Only 5 bits. There was money yet in his pocket, and with a clumsy hand he fished out a coin. The woman took the money from him, and when Ming gazed upon her face again, he nearly stopped breathing. Do I know you? He asked, the syllables tripping over his liquored tongue. Have we met? In another life, perhaps, the woman replied. In another life, everyone has met everyone. He asked her name. I travel with the magic show, she said, as though she hadn't heard, and he wondered if he'd spoken his question aloud at all. We deal in miracles. Ming frowned in concentration, struggling to order his thoughts. Ain't that you, Ada baby? Ain't you remember me? He asked at last, his voice made small and childlike in his drunkenness. He turned to see her reaction, but she was already gone. Toward the far end of the tent was a semicircular area of hard-pack earth, swept of pebbles and ringed with lanterns. Faded gray curtains strung from tent pole to tent pole marked off a backstage and wings, transforming the dirt semicircle and the canvas above it into stage and proscenium. Ringing the stage were a number of dusty pews that looked as though they had been taken from the burned church in that distant ghost town. He found a seat on a nearby pew and waited drunkenly for the magic show to begin, resting his elbows on his knees and letting his head drag his body toward the ground. There were a few dozen other men in the audience, all of them blind and drunk. Some had stretched out entirely on their pews and fallen sound asleep. At length, the ringmaster came out and rapped his cane on the stage, rousing the men. Ming's gaze swung lazily left to right before coming to rest upon the ringmaster's face, pale and pockmarked, from adolescence or perhaps from war. The man was dressed in a thin and ragged suit, patched in so many places that it seemed more patch than suit. Ming scrubbed his face with his hands and breathed deeply, hoping the liquor would ease. The ringmaster strode to the center of the stage and spoke grandly, as though to an amphitheater of thousands. Gentlemen. The audience lulled in their pews. Tonight you will see miracles. You will see them with your own two eyes, and you will know that they are miracles. I want to assure you, to give you my word, that nothing tonight deceives you. While demonstrations of this type abound, and while you have no doubt seen parlor magic in some saloon or other, I swear to it that these miracles we have for you tonight are another thing altogether. For our miracles are flesh and blood, who live and breathe as you or I, and yet possess strange and fantastic powers. Such are their abilities that when our show is concluded, I trust that you will be their apostles as readily as I or any man. Blasphemy, called the man sitting beside Ming. Ming turned his head to look at him. The man wore a priest's frock and collar, but his eyes were bloodshot and his vestments were ragged around the edges. Even from where Ming sat, he could smell the whiskey on the man's breath. The ringmaster raised an eyebrow and appraised the heckler with amusement. You, good sir, he said. Are you a priest? I was, the man slurred. He grinned and raised an amber bottle of whiskey high into the air. Till I found God in the bottle, he added loudly. A few half-hearted whoops of approval ensued. The ringmaster was unperturbed. Then you have no quarrel with our secular miracles. The ex-priest shrugged. Suppose not. Perhaps our first miracle will properly convince you, the ringmaster said. Two stagehands emerged from the wings, dragging a heavy, wrought iron cage. A naked man squatted in a dim corner of the cage, his hair matted and his eyes blank. The stagehands brought the cage next to the ringmaster and retreated into the darkened wings. A lantern swung gently from the roof of the cage. The ringmaster knocked the iron grate with his cane, and the man inside twisted his head round. Up, man, the ringmaster commanded in a low voice. The caged man stood and stepped forward under the lantern so that his full aspect was visible. A low murmur scattered through the assembled crowd. The caged man was covered completely in tattoos, inscribed from crown to sole with a litany of strange glyphs. He peered out at the crowd with an expression somewhere between curiosity and indifference. This here is Proteus, as we call him, said the ringmaster, his eyes scanning the tattooed man up and down. The man seemed not to care. The ringmaster turned back to the audience. He represents the first miracle you will see with your own two eyes tonight. The audience stirred. Now, gentlemen, I want to tell you about Proteus. He is a pagan from a remote Pacific island antipode, found by a Nantucket whaling ship, the solitary inhabitant of his own tropical isle. He speaks not a word of any civilized tongue that we know of. His curious abilities were not discovered until it was nearly too late. The whaling ship that found him was itself found when she drifted ashore off the coast of Chile, bereft of man or beast. On board, only our pagan Proteus remained. A smile crept across the ringmaster's face. For this miracle, I'll need a volunteer from the audience. He pointed his cane at a drunk sitting in the first row. You, sir. Step right up. Mumbling unintelligibly, the man stumbled up and onto the stage. The ringmaster steered him firmly before the caged pagan. On my cue, you will look Proteus in the eye and move about. Move about? The hapless volunteer mumbled. Aye, move about, the ringmaster replied. Wave your arms, tap your feet. The drunk shrugged. If you say so. Behold, the ringmaster called. He snapped his fingers, and at this cue, the first man stepped to the cage and waited. After a moment, Proteus turned his gaze to the man who had approached him. The tattooed pagan grasped the iron bars of his cage and leaned forward. The men stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. Hesitantly, the volunteer raised his arm in a kind of strange salute. Proteus moved his arm to mirror the volunteers, lagging behind, like a slow reflection in uncertain glass. Now the man lowered his arm, and Proteus did the same, the delay between them diminishing. Together they blinked, opened and closed their mouths, raised and lowered their limbs. Each was becoming more attuned to the other's movements. And then it happened. It was so quick that at first Ming didn't notice anything, and by the time he might have been able to articulate what precisely had taken place, the effect had already vanished. In the cage stood Proteus, as he had always been, and outside it the volunteer, as he had always been. But it was undeniable that for a moment it had not been Proteus in the cage, that for a moment this naked and tattooed pagan had become a precise duplicate of the man outside his cage, such that Proteus had disappeared altogether. The volunteer staggered backward in shock and fell to the stage floor. Beside Ming, the former priest sat motionless, his mouth open in awe. Several men in the audience cursed and leapt up, their pews skidding across the dirt. One man drew his gun and waved it about, though even in his drunkenness, Ming knew that this was activity without purpose or aim. The ringmaster called for the men to settle, and one by one they took their seats. The man who'd drawn his iron returned it to its holster. Proteus stood serenely in the cage, unchanged. "Thank you, good sir," the ringmaster said, helping the drunk on the stage to his feet. The volunteer's expression was fearful, and the ringmaster motioned with his cane, indicating that the man should find his seat again. From the wings came the stagehands again, and with low grunts they dragged the cage back into the shadows. Now a small figure walked onto the stage into the lantern light. It was a young boy. The ringmaster tucked his cane under an arm and with both hands guided the child by the shoulders to center stage. "This here is Hunter Reed," the ringmaster said. "He represents the second miracle you will see with your own two eyes tonight." The ringmaster stooped low so his face was level with the boy's, inspecting his face for a moment before again addressing the audience. "As you will soon find, Hunter Reed's miracle is one to be heard rather than seen, for this here boy is the world's first and only true ventriloquist." The ringmaster moved his hands through an inscrutable series of designs, and the boy nodded and held his thin arms aloft, palms open toward the audience. "You can see for yourself that he comes to us empty-handed, bearing no puppet, no props to fulfill his promise of ventriloquism. This for good reason." The ringmaster smiled broadly, and now his hands traced out a second, more complex gesture that Ming could scarcely follow. The boy lowered his arms and nodded again. "My name is Hunter Reed," he said, or seemed to say, for his lips did not move. "When I was a child, I fell ill with ague. My parents made preparations to bury me. But my fever broke on the fourth day, and with the grace of God, I made a full recovery. My dear mother and father were not so fortunate. They took ill with my same fever and died hours apart, soon after." The words were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The boy's voice sounded high and clear in Ming's head. The ex-priest beside him wore a confused and fearful expression. "The fever left me deaf and dumb," the boy said. "But I found I could still speak, and people might still hear me." "Gentlemen," the ringmaster boomed, "you are not deceived. This is no trick of the ear. This is the second miracle, the true ventriloquist." The boy bowed. Someone in the audience called out to him to ask whether he had any brothers or sisters like him, but he gave no reply. "You can't hear a damn thing," someone else said in wonderment. Another man marveled how awful silent it must be inside the boy's head. Next, the boy demonstrated singing. He sang a song that played in Ming's mind. He demonstrated whispering and shouting. He demonstrated how he could choose to speak to only one person, or two or three, or the whole lot of them. When he was finished, the ringmaster caught his gaze and signed something to him, and at this the boy bowed once more and bid the audience good night. Now the ringmaster called for the third miracle. Their last miracle, he said, was also their most impressive. It had caused men and women alike to faint, horses to scatter, and observers to utter cries of witchcraft and terror. From the dark wings of the stage emerged the woman who had first called Ming to the magic show. She was dressed in a diaphanous gown, and she carried in one hand a torch, and in the other a crystal decanter that glinted in the inconstant light of her torch. Ming sat transfixed. "Gentlemen," the ringmaster said with a twirl of his cane, "I present to you, for your consideration, the third and final miracle, which you will see with your own two eyes this evening." With an outstretched hand, he motioned to the woman with the torch and decanter and began to retreat towards the wings. "The Fireproof Woman," the ringmaster announced. The Fireproof Woman swept her torch in an arc, describing a curve of heat and light. She brought the flame down close to the earth, where it spilled and licked over the dirt. And now she waved it before the men sitting closest to her, who shrank away from the fire. A stagehand carried out a small pyre of kindling and brush and set it down on the stage. The Fireproof Woman lofted her torch into the air, and theatrically she strode over to the pyre. "I test the reality of the flame," she said. She touched the torch to the kindling, and shortly the pyre erupted in gouts and swaying tongues of fire. "Real fire," she said. She set the crystal decanter down by her feet, and holding the torch close to her body, she danced her free hand through the flame, slower than seemed possible, a slowness lingering at the edge of believability. She smiled at the audience, and Ming's breath caught in his throat. "I do not burn," the woman said, bending down to collect the decanter. "I cannot burn," she declared, her voice firm. In a single smooth motion, she uncorked the decanter with her thumb and upended it over her head. The wet contents poured out and saturated her gown, heavy and translucent, so that the curves of her body were visible in the wavering firelight. It took only a second for the fumes to travel to the pews, and when they reached Ming, he knew that it was kerosene. He was gripped by an unconscious urge to leap up and stop her. Dripping in kerosene that shimmered gossamer over her body, the Fireproof Woman dropped the torch at her glistening feet, and in an instant she was afire. The men in the front row kicked backward reflexively, nearly toppled their pews. The audience cried out in earnest. Ming stared, paralyzed, as, wreathed in flames, the fireproof woman touched a burning finger to her incandescent lips. Hush now. Look, she was all right. Her gown was burning away into drifting embers, and she stood naked and utterly untouchable before her shocked audience. She clasped her hands together and bowed low, picking up her torch again. At this precise moment, the fire began to sputter along her lithe body, snaking and writhing in twisting sheets of flame. And then she clapped a hand over her torch and snuffed it out. In an instant, woman and torch were together extinguished, leaving a darkness that was total and cold. Someone had turned out the lanterns and the stage lights. In that sudden darkness, Ming heard her quiet footsteps receding from the stage, and then the shuffling of stagehands followed by the booted feet of the ringmaster returning to the stage. One of the stagehands relit a lantern, and the ringmaster appeared before them in dim relief. "Thank you," he said simply, and with that, the show was over. The man seated beside Ming broke into cheers, and other spectators soon followed. Ming sat for a while as the audience thinned and filtered out. He had half a mind to go and speak to the fireproof woman, to tell her how familiar she was to him already, to hold her in his arms, and call her by a different woman's name. Ming rose from his pew and at once was forced back down by a wave of nausea. He was still blind drunk. Again he tried to stand, but again he had to sit, breathing slow and deep. He closed his eyes and the world reeled. He wondered if the fireproof woman would understand, if he told her how much she reminded him of his Ada, whose face he could not quite remember anymore anyway. Besides, it was not that the two women looked alike exactly, but rather that they seemed to be iterations on similar forms. He felt himself sliding, or perhaps falling, whether forward or backward he did not know, did not care to know. All movement tended downward at close of day. All movement everywhere has always tended downward. His head came to rest on the cool earth with a muffled and painless jolt. A moment or 1,000 moments passed. Then hands were tugging at his arms. He was pulled upright, and with one arm draped around a small figure at his side, he began to walk. So that was chapter 11.
Wow. Bravo.
Thank you.
Actually, we have a somebody's attendee and said, James, wow, this is amazing. How did you decide to include magical realism in your story? Because it works.
That's a great question, James. Thank you for asking it. I did a lot of field work for this. I say field work. I just drove places and took pictures. But being in these places, I was driving through Nevada. And it was August, so it was unbelievably hot. And I remember getting out of the car and having to take a minute to catch my breath before I could do anything. The places that Ming travels through, Bonneville Salt Flats or the Sierras, these places, you go there, and you've seen pictures, but you go there and the pictures don't even seem to make sense. You're in a place that is total and kind of demands every single ounce of attention you have. And I wanted to include magical realism because I thought it would bring out that kind of character, that kind of unbelievable quality of these landscapes. And I think the other thing that is useful with these, these supernatural characters and this show is that it kind of echoes this way that the remarkable is being converted to spectacle. That these people have totally, they have world-changing powers, and they're rendered safe for consumption and for society by converting them into entertainment, into spectacle. And so they actually become in danger rather than dangerous themselves. And I think that's one of the ways I think this conversion of the extraordinary into spectacle is one of the ways that white society operates to kind of to continue white supremacy and to extend the parameters of a society that excludes the certain other by taking what is remarkable and strange and fantastical, magical, and making it into something that you can pay for and see. And I think that whole process was really interesting to explore. And the other thing is it's just so much fun to write. It becomes much more fun when there are characters who have magic powers. And I guess those are the reasons. And I'm glad you think it works.
It does. You had mentioned heat, and later on readers will know that you talk a lot about dreams. Talk about memory and fading, which the reader will get to. Blurred lines. Is this caused by the heat and dehydration,
yeah.
or?
There's definitely a delirium that sneaks in, a couple minutes into standing in 115-degree heat. But I think the other thing that's at work there is this kind of I'm always been fascinated by memory, partly because I think my own memory is quite poor, and this experience of kind of like going back through boxes of souvenirs or even back through the camera roll in your phone and kind of seeing a picture and suddenly remembering something totally intense that had been forgotten to you up until then, and that leads to this kind of thought, which is perhaps the memories that I think about the least, perhaps those memories that I have not remembered in years, could it be that those are the ones who are the truest to life? Because every time you remember something, you're not pulling a file off a shelf. You're recreating something, an experience in the present. And so thinking about memory is never, it's never a journey into the past. It's actually an activity that you do in the here and the now, where you adjust your lived experience so that you can re-experience something that now only exists for you. And so this kind of this tension between what is accurately remembered and what is a dream and what is actual reality, I think it's interesting to kind of move between those kind of fluidly and build that sense of uncertainty.
Well, I think the psychologist once told me that the stronger you are, more adamant about remembering something, it's the more you wish it would actually happen that way. So it's really interesting that, and you also, dreams play a big part of and there's a blurred line for Ming Su between dreams and reality, isn't there?
Yeah, and often he'll have dreams that seem to pull from memory or seem to be warped permutations of reality, and I think that for me is I mean, that's just true to my own experience, where you sometimes you wake up from a dream and it feels so intensely real that you can see the structures of the dream decaying around you in real time as you kind of fall back into reality. And Marcel Proust has this great image of someone sleeping, where he says, when a man is asleep, he holds his hours around him in a circle. And he has this scene where Marcel, I guess the narrator, he wakes up in his room, and as he wakes up, it's before dawn. He has remembered, he's reconstructed his room in his dream, and as he wakes up, he realizes that he's gotten it kind of wrong, and so the window morphs into a desk, and the walls kind of contract, and the desk morphs into becomes a painting. And it's that kind of fluidity, the possibility that reality is an experience we choose to have, and dreams are an experience that we build for ourselves, and whether or not those two have any overlap, I think has always been kind of spooky and interesting to me.
I'm glad you mentioned fluidity, because your story is very fluid. And I'm not a big fan of Westerns in general. I just think that they lack that fluidity. So thank you for doing that. I wanted to get back. We have a few other questions we'll get to in a minute. But I wanted to get back to the character Ming Su. You chose him to be Chinese American as opposed to Chinese. Why did you do that?
I think that it has to do with kind of the genre that we're operating in as well, which is the Western. I think putting anyone in a Western, immediately you are making a claim as to whether or not they belong in America. I think that's kind of the motive of the Western, is that there is, because it's unstable ground. The 1860s, like historically, were the government is pushing westward, and we're building this railroad, and the idea is that once we link the West Coast to the East Coast, then we just close in on the middle. And that process gets kind of valorized in Westerns as being, might makes right. But what it ends up being, if you look at the history, is just genocide, and kind of horrific atrocities committed at every turn. There's actually a town that shows up in the book, Dunglen. And as I was doing research for Dunglen, one of the things that comes up is just an account that someone, like a letter that someone sent in to, I think it's Sacramento Union, but it's an old paper that no longer exists. And he is reporting quite happily on this expedition that he just went on, where he went and killed about 25 indigenous people near Dunglen. And like that's the memory that gets passed down to us. That's what is preserved in the kind of a received traditional Western. And I think so you have to be quite careful when you distribute modern anxieties and kind of mix those with those racial histories of violence and oppression. And so I think making Ming Chinese American was important because I'm Chinese American, and also because having a character in a Western who and my hope is that you read it and you think, well, this Ming can only be American. And he knows so much about the land, and he travels through this continent, and yet everywhere he goes, he is told that he isn't American. And so to kind of watch that process, to watch that struggle, I think was useful for me as well. Me who was also trying to figure out like where I belong and like what my own identity is. And so it was kind of interesting to kind of tackle that from a fiction side as well.
It's funny you mentioned, because you are Chinese American. I mean, you were, 4 when you moved over, so you don't remember much of China, do you? I mean, as a child.
Yeah, almost nothing. Almost nothing. And in fact, I would actually go ahead and say nothing.
Okay. Well, that's similar to Kazuo Ishiguro, who considers himself an Englishman. And when he writes about Japanese stories, like Pale View of Hills, he felt like he had to write it from an outsider's perspective because he left Japan at an early age to move to England. So it's very similar in that regard. In terms of Ming, he is very underestimated. And I think like Asian peoples then and even now are underestimated. Yet I think that's how he uses that to his advantage, isn't it?
Yeah. I think underestimated is a great word, and I think it's only part of what's going on, because I think the other part of it is that, and if you look at like kind of historical contemporary accounts of what's going on, as they're talking about importing all these Chinese workers, like these words come up a lot: industrious or economical. Economical, by the way, it refers to that they were cheap to hire, not economical in any other sense. So that it's the same way that you would say like buying from Costco is economical. And I think what happens is underestimation, but it's also a very kind of it's reduction. That all of these people, each of whom is an individual and has their own hopes and dreams, they become reduced to either productive forces of labor or preordained kind of personality metrics for how they not only how they would respond, but how they ought to respond in American society. And it has always interested me, this idea that like while you are fighting for liberation, it is possible to mine the underside of oppression for individual gain. That if you that it might be possible to convert some of that marginalization, some of that othering to your own advantage, and to operate in this kind of null space that is not ideal, because ideally what you want is liberation, but this in between, this state of where you use those tools of oppression and kind of turn them back on the oppressor and operate in that kind of context. And Ming that's why Silas picks up Ming as an orphan, is to train him to be invisible in this kind of racialized sense as he commits his assassinations.
Well, he's also called John throughout the book. And if you could talk a little about what the meaning of calling, well, they use the term Chinaman a lot. I think you use it correctly in historical context, but I think it was John Chinaman.
Yeah.
Isn't that what?
John Chinaman is the same, like, the way that we have John Doe. If there was a Chinese person that was being referred to in a newspaper or anything, like they wouldn't get his name. That's too complicated. So everyone was John Chinaman, which became shortened to John. And so there's a reporter's account as he's riding the train up over the Sierras, kind of for the first time, and he says, John leans out of the carriage, whooping and waving his hat, And that was actually one of the first sources that I encountered. And I remember trying to figure out like who this John is, to see if I could maybe get his account. And it was, I remember it was a shock to realize that John Chinaman was just like, that's just what they called every single Asian looking person for many, many, many years.
And we get to the term Chinaman. You use it, I think, correctly, and not liberally, but correctly. It's obviously a slur. But in the context of history, I mean, that's how Chinese people are called. And did you have any difficulty using it or any struggles?
It definitely, I mean, you type it out and you look at it and you're like, good God. But I think it's important that when you engage in history, especially when you engage, actually, just speaking for me, when I engage in the history of the Western and kind of like began to use these tropes and these archetypes, it felt necessary that it wasn't prettied up in any kind of way, that it wasn't made anodyne, that there were ugly parts of this Western beyond all of that that's already been said, and to be accurate to the historical qualities there, so that all of these fantastical and other elements could take on that same sheen of realism, right? Because in a novel where everything else is correct, it becomes a little more plausible that the impossible things could also be correct.
How difficult was it for you? You mentioned a lot of things that happened about Chinese exclusion and what had happened without making it a history book, which I really appreciate because I think that interrupts the flow. But how were you able to communicate what had happened over history in the 50 years, latter half of the 19th century, to Chinese people and the start of even the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, I think research for me is I've always been really into research. I mean, I was like, I did my undergrad in like English criticism, and like now in grad school, I'm really into big on research. I mean, it's also for me like an avoidance tactic, because if I do research that I don't have to write, and writing is horrible. But I think you have this kind of idea of a story. You have something that you want to do. And the more research you do, the more that story solidifies. You realize ways that you could weave through or around or between different historical markers. And I mean, I think the ultimate goal of any historical research is to kind of enter into that consensual hallucination of perhaps I could actually have, know what it was like to be alive during that time. And I think that was the goal of the research, is to do all this research to bring those experiences close to the body, so that then I could go out and kind of almost make myself an artifact of that time, so that when I wrote, these historical events would just simply come out in that writing, rather than trying to make any explicit reference to this or that, to have such an intricate knowledge of all the things that were going on at the time that when I wrote it just ends up weaving through and around those signposts.
I'm glad you did it that way, using it as a marker, historical marker. I like that term, but it just seemed like it didn't seem forced. It seemed natural. So we have a question from Tyler Bennett. So many books/movies just have a character travel to X town in a vague manner. What made you decide to ground the travels with a map and directions and mileage and time? Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tyler. The truth is that I like, it just feels important to me to get that kind of stuff right. And I mean, I think we talked about this earlier, that picture of all those people completing the thing at completing the railroad at Promontory Point, and all of these, the way that like Chinese workers are kind of written out of history. And I think it's important to remember, like, they've been written out of very specific history, which is like the kind that you can like pick up a book and read. I mean, now Erica Lee's got that great book out, so now you can actually pick it up and read it. Yeah. But they were out of a kind of canonical academic history. But what they could not be written out of was the labor that they did. Like, there is no erasing the grade that runs from Sacramento to Omaha that was built, the western half of it was built by Chinese hands. There is no flooding all of the marshes and wetlands that Chinese laborers helped to drain the Central Valley of California. The fruit that we eat, that the almonds that we put in like our smoothies and whatever, like those come from lands that were a lot of times made arable and available by Chinese labor. And so even though they've been written out of a kind of academic narrative history, the stuff that they've done, the labor, the work of hands remains. And I think it felt important to me to really get that right, because they are traversing a land that has been changed, almost terraformed by forgotten labor, by overlooked labor. And so making sure that this town exists, they're going from here to here, and that's how long it would take. I wanted to generate a sense of how expansive and endless this land was, and also how real it is, that you're passing by actual places, actual things that have been done to the earth.
Mm-hmm. What I really like along that lines is you gave us a sense of the journey, and that was really effective. By the way, plug for Erica's book, The Making
Great
of
book.
Asian American. It's an amazing book, so I highly recommend it. We have another question from Jerry. Are there writers from whom you draw inspiration that inform your writing in terms of themes, style, character, etc.?
Yeah, certainly. I would say Steinbeck, for the way that Steinbeck, I think, is one of his greatest skills is just nailing the feel of a place. Like, you read a Steinbeck novel and you're like, you have a kind of visceral bodily experience of setting in place. And I think that's something that I really admire about Steinbeck. I really like Borges and Saramago and the Hungarian writer Laszlo Krasznahorkai. They all kind of play with magical realism adjacent, and they all have these, like, they have such beautiful sentences. And I read them in translation because I'm not good with languages, but their sentences are lyrical and flowing, and the way that they kind of approach and then engage with the possibility of magic, I've always really admired. Borges in particular is like, every one of his stories is like 5 pages to blow your mind. And I also really liked land art, which is not really a writer, but the kind of the work of James Turrell, Sky Spaces, and I think it was Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty, and Michael Heiser, Double Negative. Just these works that was in the 60s and 70s. A bunch of artists like went out into the Western landscape with like bulldozers, and they made pieces of land art. They just moved a lot of earth around.
Wow.
And like Double Negative, for instance, there's a canyon, and he has put a kind of a perpendicular canyon right through the walls of that. And that kind of art has always kind of really moved me. I think for those same reasons of, like, the questions of permanence and kind of human activity on the earth.
Interesting. So Lee wanted to know, how long did this whole process take you to put this project together?
The research took about two years and change. And the writing of it was, I think I got maybe a third to a half of it at the beginning of 2019. And then I moved out to Davis for grad school. And I knew that if I started grad school, I would never finish the book. So I sat in my living room and I just wrote every single day. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I finished the rest of the book in about 2 months or so. But I had outlines, I had research, like I had a wealth of material. I had just been putting off writing for so long that I think when I finally got to it, it was already all there.
Wow. You said you didn't like the writing so much. Why is that, as opposed to the research? Why was writing so difficult for you when it seemed like it just came out so naturally?
I mean, research is just collecting. You just pick up cool stuff that you like and you make a note of it. And writing is suddenly so expansive. You have so much freedom to absolutely shoot yourself in the foot. You have a wealth of ways that you can make a tiny mistake and have it just like come and clock you, tens of thousands of words later. And so it was also a kind of apprehension. I wasn't sure I could do it, and I didn't. And I think in some ways I didn't want to find out if I couldn't do it. The possibility of the unwritten novel is always more pleasant than having tried and failed to write one.
Ah,
And the other thing is I write incredibly slowly. My output is maybe like 1,000 words every 8 hours, and that's a great day for me.
yeah.
So between all those things, and it just exhausts me. It like absolutely drains me. So that's why writing is hard for me.
Okay. So wait, I think we have one more question here. Let's see. All right. Lisa wanted to know, you talk about the writing being horrible. Did you not feel that the characters wrote themselves as some writers have described?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing that I didn't expect was this kind of feeling of obligation to my characters, of wanting to get their stories right, and being afraid that I would mess it up. That I kind of had a sense of like how they would react to each other, and they began to feel like real people. And as that happens, you also realize that real people are terrifying because you can let them down, and you can put them in situations where they don't belong, and where they're miserable. And so it ended up, the characters, I maybe didn't write themselves, but they definitely like began to exist for me, and that I think only contributed to how exhausting I found the process.
Mm-hmm. So what was Ming telling you?
I think Ming is, I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy, but he has a place to be. He has things to do. He has obligations, and when he doesn't think about what he's doing, when he doesn't think about his obligations, he's great. He's good at his job. And the thing that really guts him is having to stop and remember, having to stop and think. And as he has to do that more and more, it changes kind of the quality of his actions.
So I have to share this photo with you really quickly. That is on top is my grandfather around the turn of the century. The middle guy was my great grandfather. And I think the guy on the bottom was my great great grandfather who came over around the time that Ming Su was wreaking havoc on the West fictionally. I think it's been a long time coming for fiction writers or novelists to write about this genre, but I think that you and C. Pam and I'm sure Jenny will have filled that void, and we really appreciate that because I think it's a long forgotten time about a forgotten people. So we thank you for that.
Thank you. So that means so much to me.
Well, Tom, thank you again. It's a wonderful book. I wish you the best. And hold out for the big money for the adaptation. Make sure it's a series, not a movie. Make it a limited series, not a movie. And thank you for joining us. And I wish you the best. And also, I have to pass on good wishes from Charlie Yu, who wrote Interior Chinatown. He couldn't be here, but he thinks the world of you, and he looks forward to
that's fantastic. That makes my whole month.
Well, thank you, everyone, and
thank
please
you,
buy Thousand Crimes of Ming Su. It's a wonderful book. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.